Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 9. Hymns in the back pew. Sunday light through stained glass always landed like a promise, but lately the colors felt like someone else's truth. Jonah started going to church the way a tired traveler returns to a familiar inn, seeking rest, not spectacle. He sat in the back pew where the wood had been worn smooth by generations of hands, the place where a man can fold into anonymity and still be held by ritual. The hymn swelled and the organ filled the room with a sound that smoothed the edges of the weak, but the comfort was thin. The congregation's faces, polite and kind in general, were shaded now with an unfamiliar caution when they glanced his way. Mara attended too, always in the front rows, composed and decisive, the visible example of a wife who kept everything in order. She greeted others with a practiced cheer, shaking hands, offering church minutes, the portrait of someone who belonged in the light. Jonah watched from the back as she moved through the room with a confidence that made his chest ache. Her manner there was public scripture, calm, righteous, unassailable. At coffee hour people would thank Mara for organizing a drive or point to her as the one who corrected a scheduling mistake. They asked about the children and commended Mara's steadiness. Jonah, when he ventured into the bright hall, received nods that felt thinner, sympathetic, cautious, like glances given to someone who'd had a mishap. He learned to accept the small kindnesses without the expectation of vindication. The church was a place of worship, not a courtroom. Once he reached out to the pastor, not from anger but from a cramped need. He wanted someone to name the complexity of loving publicly and failing privately, to hold the tension between sin and mercy without taking sides based on a polished narrative. The pastor listened with pastoral gentleness, offered scripture, and encouraged patience and prayer. But spiritual counsel can be practical and slow. It's rarely a sudden reweaving of reputations. Jonah left feeling steadied but also acutely aware that his story would not be rewritten by a sermon in a day. Sundays that used to be warm with family clustered together changed. Mara sat strategically, children flanking her like a chosen banner. Jonah's attempt to sit closer once felt like a misstep. Emma's posture stiffened, Luke's jaw tightened, Sophie's fingers retreated from his hand. He settled back into anonymity again because the cost of pushing felt too high. In the quiet between hymns, he prayed for his kids, asking that they would come to know him in more than edited phrases, and for the courage to keep showing up even if the welcome was chilled. There were moments of mercy. An elderly woman pressed a note into his hand once, a tiny scrap of encouragement signed with a cross and a "Keep the faith." A youth leader who had known Jonah before the cracks started waved him over for an after-service chat about a volunteer slot. Those small, human acts felt like fringe blessings, not sweeping repairs, but stitches in a garment being slowly mended. On a cold winter evening, after a service that felt both ordinary and strained, Jonah stayed behind and opened his Bible on a pew. The book felt like a steady anchor beneath his palms. He read aloud quietly the Psalms he had always loved, words of lament and of hope woven together. He let the language name his small defeats and his small hopes in the same breath. Prayer wasn't always answers, but it was a practice of returning, and in returning he kept his heart from calcifying. Leaving the church that night, he watched Mara glide into the parking lot, greeting the children, chatting with friends. The gap between them was measurable in small gestures, the firmness of her handshakes, the ease of her laughter. Jonah felt the ache, but he also felt something else, a steadying conviction that faith didn't abandon him when stories turned unkind. He would keep coming to the back pew, to the slow work of prayer and presence, trusting that truth sometimes arrives in the small endurance of ordinary faithful acts rather than in sudden public declarations. Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 10. Frosted doors. Winter arrived like the hush after a sermon, soft at first but determined. The maple in the yard wore frost on its bare branches and morning puddles held a thin, glassy skin. Jonah noticed the change in the house the way a man recognizes a shifted timbre in a beloved hymn. familiar notes arranged into a new, colder key. Doors were still doors, but their function had altered. They became thresholds not just of space but of judgment and exclusion. On a morning that smelled of peat and kettle steam, Mara's patience wore an edge Jonah could feel even before she spoke. She had a list, meticulous, folded, and ironclad. It began as practicalities, bills, schedules, errands, and quickly translated into moral accounting. He tried to answer with facts, calendar entries, texts that showed he'd been the one to reschedule the plumber, the one to pick up a prescription. Her responses were calm and precise. Each correction landed like a final tally. "You always forget," she said, more a statement of law than a complaint. He left that day with a small duffel because arguing at the threshold had become its own punishment. The car heater hummed like a small companion as he drove to the cheap motel he now knew well. Snow feathered down in long quiet threads. He sat in the glow of the dashboard and opened his Bible, the small print like a map of mercy. The words steadied him for a while. But the ache returned when he remembered the little rituals of household life, how Mara liked the spoon in the right drawer, how Sophie always wanted an extra pancake, and how those rituals had become the ground on which accusations were planted. Back at the house, Mara locked more doors. Not metaphorically, locks changed, combinations were altered, and Jonah found that returning sometimes required a ritual he had not consented to: calls, waiting, the contingency of permission rather than belonging. There is an indignity in needing permits for reinsertion into your own life. He learned to knock anyway, gentle and small, as if asking to be let back into the family's fold was not an indignity but a necessary courtesy. Sometimes the door would open, sometimes it would remain closed with a polite curtained silence behind it. The children's rooms felt different too. He used to be able to slip into Sophie's room at night and smooth her hair back as she slept. Now he sometimes found himself standing at the hallway's edge, an outsider watching the private geography of his children's lives from a polite distance. Emma left notes of practical thanks on the fridge. "Thanks for driving me," scrawled with a pencil that seemed to release more apology than gratitude. Luke's text came at odd hours with the economy of someone who didn't want to be overheard. The intimacy he'd once taken for granted had become a guarded commodity. One afternoon, returning with groceries, Jonah found the front door bolted from the inside. He knocked and called, voice soft enough not to agitate, but the bolt held. He pressed his palm to the cold wood and felt the small, absurd wish that heat could melt metal. He waited on the porch until the crumbs of patience wore thin and the bite of November wind turned his fingers numb. Someone walked past on the sidewalk. Neighbors who had once waved now moved with heads down, and Jonah felt his life compressed to the size of a stoop. It was not only the bolt that stung but the message behind it. Access could be controlled. Belonging could be measured and rationed. He understood, perhaps more than ever, how power can masquerade as protection. The house yard, which had once been the setting for pickup games and backyard barbecues, now felt like the perimeter of a small nation with customs officers and guarded visas. The motel bed that night was harder than it had been in the early days. Things that had once been tolerable now left small bruises that took longer to fade. Jonah lay awake and turned the memory of childhood Torah lessons and bedside prayers into a quiet litany, lines that were prayer and rehearsal both. He named the things he had done well and the things he wished he had done differently. He prayed for wisdom to discern when to fight and when to conserve his strength for the long game of parenting and presence. In the weeks that followed, the frost that stiffened the world also seemed to sharpen Jonah's resolve in an unexpected way. The locked doors taught him the difference between yielding for peace and surrendering his personhood. He began to keep his small shoebox of notes and receipts in the motel safe instead of the attic, no longer a private relic, but an organized archive he could reach for when the story needed quiet testimony. He also began leaving small, non-confrontational notes in the family journal Mara maintained. Fixed Sophie's bicycle chain today. Left extra pancakes in the fridge. Love, Dad. The notes were small gestures, truths left like pebbles at a shoreline. One evening, returning from a volunteer's shift at the community pantry, Jonah found the back door unlatched and a small plate on the counter with half a sandwich, Sophie's handwriting on the paper towel beneath it. The gesture was tiny and imperfect, evidence that all doors were not sealed shut, that small openings could still be negotiated through love and patience. He ate in the dim kitchen and felt both gratitude and heartbreak, the two folding into each other like twin seams. Frosted doors taught Jonah the exactness of boundaries and the cruelty of using them as instruments rather than protections. They carved out new lines in a life he had shared, lines he had not consented to but learned to respect while he kept searching for ways back in. In the still of that winter's night, he resolved to be more intentional, to record, to pray, to show up in ways that did not demand applause but testified to a steady affection. The doors might be frosted now, but seasonal weather shifts, he believed, and where frost settles it can also melt. He would live with that possibility tucked close to his heart. Falling leaves, rising light. Chapter 11, Voicemails and Vacancies. The phone became a registrar of absence. Jonah learned the particular ache of listening to his own voice on loop, messages recorded with careful patience, left in the small hours or between shifts, words he rehearsed until they sounded like prayer. He found comfort in the ritual of speaking into the phone, imagining the kids listening later and hearing something true. Often the messages were practical, a reminder about a dentist appointment, a promise to pick up milk, an offer to help with a science project. Other times the voicemails were small confessions, apologies for a harsh tone, a memory he wanted to share, a joke about an inside thing only they used to laugh at. He saved them like talismans and replayed them in the motel room or in the heat of his idling car. More often than not, the messages went unanswered. The silence after the tone settled like a physical thing, a room in his chest that did not have furniture. On nights when loneliness pressed hardest, Jonah would listen again, not for replies but to remind himself that he had not stopped trying. He told himself the messages were seeds. Some would fall on good soil, some on stones, but faith required planting. Sometimes there were short, clipped replies that read as if written by someone holding a script another person had rehearsed. "We're fine, Dad," one text read, sting-laced and final. On other days his calls went straight to voicemail, and the quiet space after the automated beep felt like the house had been vacated not by people but by understanding. He learned to live with that vacancy in the same way a person learns to live with a persistent draft. Seal what you can, wear a sweater, and keep moving. Jonah kept fanciful hopes. One day a long voice message where Emma would tell him the whole play-by-play of her life. Or Luke would call with a list of problems he trusted his father to help solve. Or Sophie would call between classes to ask something silly that would dissolve every worry. Those hopes were not reckless. They were honest offerings he refused to abandon. When a reply did come, a single emoji, a curt K, or a late night miss you, that felt more like obligation than longing, he held it up like sunlight through a cloud and thanked God for small mercies. Vacancies showed up in other ways. Seats at school performances that used to be crowded with family dwelled emptier. Holiday photos lacked the easy, candid warmth they once had. Jonah found himself in the audience, a careful presence by the exit, clapping with the anatomical precision of someone who wanted, above all, to be there. He stopped asking for front-row forgiveness. He showed up at whatever edge of the life he was allowed, and sometimes sat with the ache of not being nearer. There were practical humiliations too. Insurance forms mailed to the house flagged him as no longer resident, in terms that felt bureaucratically final. Packages that once arrived with simple family notes now came addressed in formal tones. It felt as if the paperwork of life had been adjusted to reflect the new map Mara had drawn, official lines that made the vacancy seem less temporary. Jonah filled out forms and signed fields and watched bureaucratic ink erase him in small, civil increments. At work, he practiced professional restraint. He showed up on time, finished drawings to spec, double-checked details. His coworkers did not ask about his home life. They saw only the competent drafter who could fix a gnarly detail in a design. The dissonance between the dependable man at the drafting board and the man whose children barely returned calls felt like a private fracture. Jonah held both halves together by habit and by prayer. One gray afternoon, a voicemail arrived different from the rest. It was not from one of his children but from an old friend who had heard, in private, a different version of the story. The message was short and hesitant. "Hey John. I don't have answers. I just wanted to say I'm praying for you. Lunch next week?" The words landed like a hand on his shoulder, small, human, unspectacular, but enough to remind him he had allies who saw the man he tried to be. The vacancies were not all empty. In the spaces carved out by absence, new small things came into being. Jonah began to build a routine of visits to the local library on quiet afternoons, borrowing biographies and sermons and books about grace. He learned the names of the barista who made his coffee strong and the custodian at the community center who kept a careful watch of the lost and found. Those connections were simple and reliable, not dramatic salvation but the slow accretion of neighborly constancy. Still, the voicemail box kept its weight. Each unanswered message asked the same small question: had he done enough? Had he been enough? The answers weren't clean. Some days the ledger of his life felt balanced: small acts of love, kindness for neighbors, patient presence at events. Other days the balance tilted toward absence and doubt. Jonah learned to live with the wobble, trusting that truth would not be lost forever and that children's hearts, like seasons, might shift back toward warmth and time. When he closed the motel door at night and lay on the narrow bed listening to the radiator, he spoke aloud the messages he had left that day. "Sophie, I packed your favorite snack. Luke, call me if you need a hand. Emma, good luck on the paper. I believe in you." Saying the words into the quiet was prayer and practice both. He was shipping his love across the empty spaces and waiting, patient as he could be, for the correspondence of return. Falling Leaves, Rising Light. Chapter 12, The Slow Unravel. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic collapse, no shouted goodbye or suitcase flung into the street. The unraveling came like a fray at the hem of a well-worn coat, quiet, persistent, and easy to ignore until the whole garment no longer held. Jonah first noticed it in the way time stretched between conversations. Where once there had been daily check-ins, now there were gaps. Mara stopped asking about his day, and when he offered details, she nodded with the distracted politeness of someone listening to a weather report. The children, too, began to orbit him differently. Emma's replies became monosyllabic. Luke's jokes lost their punch. Sophie still reached for his hand, but even that felt more like habit than hunger. The house, once a place of shared breath and overlapping footsteps, began to feel like a waiting room. Jonah moved through it like a guest overstaying his welcome, careful not to leave dishes in the sink, folding blankets with precision, offering to help with tasks that were met with a tight smile or a dismissive, "I've got it." He started to sleep on the couch more often, not because he was asked to, but because the bed had become a battlefield of silence. One night, after a long shift and a longer drive, he came home to find the locks changed again. No note. No warning. Just the cold click of a key that no longer fit. He stood on the porch for a long time, the grocery bag in his hand growing heavier by the minute. Inside, he could hear the muffled sound of the television and the occasional burst of laughter. He knocked once, then twice. No answer. He didn't knock a third time. Instead, he drove to the overlook above the river, the one where he used to take the kids for ice cream and stories about stars. He sat on the hood of his car and watched the water move beneath the bridge, slow and steady, carving its way through stone. He thought about erosion, how it doesn't shout, doesn't break, just wears down what once seemed immovable. That night, in the motel room, he opened his journal and wrote, "I am not angry. I am tired. I am not leaving. I am loosening. I am not giving up. I am letting go of what was never mine to hold alone." The unraveling continued in small ways. Mara stopped including him in group texts about school events. The family calendar no longer appeared in his inbox. He found out about Luke's science fair from a neighbor, not from his son. When he showed up anyway, quiet, supportive, standing in the back. Luke's eyes flickered with something between guilt and relief. Jonah clapped the loudest when Luke's name was called, then left before the photos. He began to understand that love, when unreciprocated, becomes a kind of exile. You can still show up, still give, still hope, but the warmth you offer returns to you cold. And yet, Jonah kept showing up. Not because he believed it would fix things, but because faithfulness wasn't about outcome. It was about character. One Sunday after church, Sophie slipped her hand into his and whispered, "I saved you a cookie." It was oatmeal raisin, his least favorite, but he ate it like communion. That small act, that tiny rebellion of affection, reminded him that not everything had unraveled. Some threads still held. And so he kept weaving. With notes. With prayers. With presents. Even as the seams of his marriage came undone, Jonah stitched new cloth from the remnants, something humbler, quieter, but still warm enough to wrap around the ones he loved. The unraveling wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. Something not yet named, but already forming in the quiet spaces where truth had room to breathe. Falling Leaves, Rising Light. Chapter 13, Thanksgiving Window. The week before Thanksgiving, the town smelled of wood smoke and orchard apples. The air carried a thin, bright cold that made breath visible and neighbors' greetings more earnest. Jonah watched the season change in small things. The way the light angled lower across the driveway. The way leaves clung to gutters like tired flags. At work, the office hummed with last-minute orders and polite talk of pies and travel. At home, the calendar was crowded with rehearsed obligations and an unspoken question: who would be in which chairs? Mara planned in the efficient, immaculate way that had become her religion: list on clipped paper, a schedule for oven times printed and taped to the pantry door, a spreadsheet of guest dishes that read like a menu at a small, impeccable restaurant. Jonah offered to take rolls to his mother's house or to carve the turkey, small offers meant to share the load. She nodded without meeting his eyes. The children moved with the rhythm of interrupted joy, practicing lines for a church reading, sneaking extra pieces of pumpkin pie at friends' houses, rolling their eyes when family drama was mentioned. On the morning of the meal, he woke early and found the kitchen lit with a honeyed quiet. He set the table like someone performing a prayer, napkins folded into small boats, spoons aligned with gentle care, a sprig of rosemary placed on each plate as if to bless it. The turkey browned with a sound that felt like a small benediction. He grated nutmeg into the custard, kept the gravy warm, and moved through the recipe steps like a man who believed ritual could hold more than obligation, that it could be an offering. Guests arrived, Mara's sister with a laugh that filled the doorway, a neighbor who brought cider warm in a thermos, Jonah's mother with a cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender. The house swelled with the pleasing turbulence of good manners and real appetite. Jonah carved and passed platters, practiced small jokes, listened for the notes of real conversation among the practiced pleasantries. There were moments when Mara's smile was true and small windows opened in her face. He stored those in a corner of himself like a man saving small light for darker days. Then, as plates were cleared and children were distracted with a game in the living room, a voice, soft, private to the family, asked the question everyone knew was there. Mara's sister, neither cruel nor naive, leaned forward and said, "How are things, really?" The table went quiet enough to hear the thermostat click. Jonah felt the room compress into a single point where truth and performance met. Mara's answer was the tight one he'd seen before, practical, polished, an account that made her endurance the central fact. But this time something shifted in the way she spoke. Her voice trembled at the edges, a hairline fracture of humanity that made the sentence less a verdict and more a confession. Jonah watched the faces around the table, some sympathetic, some puzzled, some carefully neutral, and felt a cautious hope like the first thaw in a frozen creek. After dessert, when the house had settled into the warm drowsiness of leftovers and full stomachs, Emma came into the kitchen and caught Jonah's eye. She was 17, fierce and bewildered in equal measure, and for a thin moment she looked not like Mara's second self but like the child who used to climb into his lap to hear stories. "Dad," she said, voice low. "Thanks for the extra pies. That was nice." It was a small, halting kindness, but it landed like a rope thrown between two people who had drifted. Luke later texted him a photo of his science project with a caption, "Thanks for the ride." Sophie slipped a folded paper into his hand as she left for a friend's house the next day. It read, "I love you. T checks for coming to my choir." Her spelling slanted like a small child's and the loop of the Y was exuberant and earnest. The doorway between the kitchen and the living room that night felt, for the first time in months, like an actual opening. Mara lingered longer by the sink, her back to Jonah, and then turned with an unpolished question that someone else might have smoothed away. "Do you want to talk about anything?" It was not an offer wrapped in accusation but a sentence with room in it. Jonah's answer was simple and honest. "Yes. If you want." She nodded once, as if trying out a shape of generosity she had not practiced in a while. They did not solve everything in the warm spill of post-Thanksgiving light. There were no dramatic reconciliations or grand declarations. But the small acts, Emma's thanks, Luke's photo, Sophie's note, Mara's tentative reach, stitched a single seam of warmth into the fabric of their week. Jonah felt both sorrow for the months that had cooled them and a fierce, guarded gratitude for the flicker of return. That night he fell asleep on the couch with the smell of rosemary and gravy in his nose, the house breathing around him. He prayed, not for a quick fix, but for more moments like this, honest interruptions of the stories that had been told about him, openings where the children could choose nuance over repetition, and the patience to keep tending small kindnesses. The Thanksgiving window was narrow, he knew, but it let in real light. He decided to live as if that light could widen, one day and one ordinary kindness at a time. If Jonah's story resonates with you, hit like so others can discover it too. And subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart.